Good morning. Welcome to the Pollinator Grant Workshop given by Clear Lake Chapter of the Native Plant Society. I'm Cheryl Folks, and I will be your first presenter and will provide an overview of what local pollinators need from us and how that relates to the Pollinator Grant. Also with us this morning is Beverly Morrison, who will provide some information specific to trees. And Nancy Saint will go over information specific to the Pollinator Grant application. My main focus is to provide an overview of the concepts relating to pollinator habitat, including suggestions on how to select the plants most appropriate for your pollinator garden. Some of you likely have as much or more knowledge as I do about local pollinators and their needs, or some of you may just be starting on your first pollinator adventure. The photos of the pollinators and their flowers in the presentation were all taken at my home in northern Galveston County. So if you are in our grant region, these are all species that can be attracted to your pollinator garden. The one exception to that is the spider lily photo that's part of the Clear Lake Chapter's website. So that's the very first photo that was in our presentation. When I relied heavily on a specific source for the content of a slide, that source is referenced in the slide title. A pollinator carries pollen from the male part of a flower, the stamen, to the female part of the same flower or another flower, to the stigma. It's necessary for the reproduction of fruits, seeds, and young plants. Plants entice pollinators through showy flowers that offer rewards in the form of nectar and pollen. Nectar is composed of sugar and other compounds and is an important energy source for many flower visiting species, such as butterflies, hummingbirds, moths, and a variety of other insects and small animals. Nectar can vary from a 10 to 70% sugar concentration based on things like the plant species and weather. Pollen is a source of protein and fat for a smaller subset of flower visitors. Bees, while feeding on nectar, also purposely forage for pollen, collecting it as a food source for their young. Pollinators are the engines that run healthy habitats. Beetles, flies, and wasps are thought to have evolved as the first pollinators, accidentally spreading pollen while feeding on flowers. Flowers responded to particular pollinators, co-evolving with them to provide them with diverse bloom times, colors, shapes, sizes, thus improving reproductive efficiency. The flowers shown here represent a variety of those traits, and the chart shows the primary color preferences for certain pollinator groups. Ultraviolet invitations. Bees can see ultraviolet light, but not red light. Thus, flowers in the ultraviolet range attract more bee visits. Although these adult pollinators all rely on nectar from flowers for energy, each group has a unique place in the ecosystem and specific needs for raising their families. Butterflies and moths may look similar, but have important differences. Moths tend to have more hairs and be nocturnal, while butterflies were smooth and forage during the day. Both lay eggs on plants, and the larvae caterpillars are herbivores that feed exclusively on plant foliage. Depending on the species, caterpillars may be generalists, able to feed on many types of plants, or specialists with a very narrow range of plants on which they can feed. Example being the monarch butterfly and milkweed. Nearly 30% of North American native bees nest in hollow stems. Other native bees may nest under leaf litter, in the ground, or in decaying wood. On the display table is actually a sample from my garden of a woody, hollow stalk that carpenter bees have actually made homes in. You can look at it and see where they've actually carved out their home. Hummingbirds, like pollinator populations as a whole, are also experiencing declines in their numbers. They catch tiny insects to provide protein for their young. Hummers' reliance on fruit flies is an example of the connectivity and interdependence of the many components of the ecosystem. If you study systems theories, you can see how ecosystems are a vivid example of how change in one area can result in unexpected and unintended exponential changes in other areas. These flowers show a number of concepts that are important to pollinator habitats. Flowers in a variety of shapes, colors, and sizes, nectar and pollen sources throughout the growing season. They are also a combination of annuals and perennials. All the flowers shown here have broad appeal to many different pollinators, including native bees. There are 4 different native bees pictured. In discussions about pollinator gardens, there tends to be repeated reference to native bees. And just to clarify why that is specified, I'd like to read a quote from the Texas Parks and Wildlife website. Native versus non-native bees. While certainly invaluable from an agricultural perspective, honeybees are not a native component of North American natural communities and could negatively impact those systems through competition for foraging resources, disease transmission to native bees, or other means. Beyond native pollinators, there is evidence that some cavity nesting birds compete for nest sites with feral honeybee colonies to the detriment. Due to its non-native status and potential impacts on natural communities, the honeybee is more appropriately managed as a semi-free-ranging agricultural animal. The National Park System also has a similar philosophy posted about having honeybees within their boundaries. The population decline of the monarch butterfly has been well publicized. However, the American bumblebee has had an equally disturbing decline. Bombus pennsylvanicus, aka the American bumblebee, was among the broadest ranging bumblebees in North America. Its population has declined 89% since 2000 and has disappeared or is now very rare in 16 states. However, it is still found in our area and can be supported by you as you create more pollinator habitat. Bumblebees have the rare ability to thermoregulate. They are able to generate heat. Bumblebees rely entirely on flowering plants for food. The adults feed primarily on nectar, but their larvae require pollen protein for growth. The bumblebee's back legs have pollen baskets, pouches that are used to hold pollen grains collected from flowers. Bumblebees are able to shake pollen out of flowers by rapidly vibrating their bodies in a motion with a loud buzzing sound. This special extraction process is called buzz pollination. We've talked a bit about who the pollinators are. Now we'll look at the elements necessary to create a pollinator community. A pollinator garden is a complete habitat that provides food, nesting areas, overwintering sites for a variety of pollinators, including butterflies, native bees, and moths. Your pollinator community should include food for the babies, food for the grown-ups, and housing. Housing could be bare ground, leaf litter, woody stems, or trees and shrubs. And just like we don't want toxic chemical spills close to our homes, it's essential to avoid pesticides and other toxic substances in and around your pollinator community. Pollinators are threatened by habitat loss, including dramatic declines in native plant communities. This nearly invisible ecosystem is a precious resource that requires attention and support, and in disturbing evidence found around the world is increasingly in jeopardy. In addition to total loss of habitat, the fragmentation of habitat has emerged as a major problem for wildlife, including pollinators. Some pollinators only travel a few hundred feet in search for resources and homes. We can help by creating more pollinator habitat. Some basic considerations for pollinator habitat include plants in sunny or mostly sunny areas. Butterflies and other pollinators like to bask in the sun. Many of their favorite flowers grow best in sun or part sun. Many native plants prefer well-draining soil with no additional fertilizer. And for some plants, some of those native plants, adding additional fertilizer just promotes leafy growth over the development of flowers. You should aim for a buffet of flowers, a mix of shapes, heights, and colors. Pollinators also need areas with protection to rest, like trees, shrubs, brush piles, dead wood, or tall grass. It's also important to leave some bare ground. Butterflies get minerals from the soil, and some bees nest in the ground. When you're designing your garden, imagine the view from a pollinator's perspective flying overhead. Masses of color will attract their attention and them to your garden. It's considered that you should plant in layers with tall plants in the back and the middle, shorter plants at the edges. Larval host plants, like clumps of native grasses, can be interspersed among the flowering plants. Contrasting leaf size and shape also increases visual appeal for us. A border and signage helps the garden to look intended and prevents well-meaning maintenance crews from weeding or mowing the area. Elements of a pollinator garden. In deciding which plants to include in your pollinator community, you may want to use a combination of annuals and perennials along with native grasses. Annuals live for one growing season, but you can select native annuals that reseed and return the following year. Perennials tend to bloom for a specific season, a few weeks to some months, but likely will return for subsequent years. Perennials like to get their root systems established before putting their energy into flower production. So there's a saying for perennials: the first year they sleep, the second year they creep, and the third year they leap after getting their root systems established. So consider using annuals to fill in around the perennials until they get established. Flowering trees may also provide very early nectar sources essential for pollinators. This particular photo shows the remains of a citrus tree, the trunk, along the right side of the photo as you're viewing it. Left side. And I'm turned around. And it's a citrus tree that froze 2.5 years ago. We cut off the extending branches and left the trunk of the tree as a perch for birds and a resource for insects. This slide has some recommendations from the Xerces Society. If you can imagine a pollinator party, most importantly, it's a pesticide-free habitat. Pesticides, habitat loss, habitat fragmentation have had very large negative impact on pollinators. Once again, Consider how a pollinator will view your garden while doing a flyover. Big, bold clusters of bloom are what will attract their attention and draw them to your garden. Ensure blooming plants from early spring until the end of migration in the fall to provide resources for the entire growth cycle. Planting in clusters helps minimize the energy that pollinators expend when moving from one flower to another. Thus, a recommendation to space your plants very closely, given how big they will ultimately get, to create clusters of pollen. Some recommendations are to group 5 to 9 plants together, although it really depends on the mature size. A rattlesnake master can have a spread of 4 to 5 feet, so one of those may be all that you need. These flowering plants all have broad appeal to numerous pollinators, and when planted together, provide nectar and pollen resources from early spring through the fall. Many flowers signal pollinators by changing color at different stages of development, attracting pollinators when they need them the most, thus increasing the efficiency of pollinators they depend on. Nectar guides are contrasting patterns of flower shades, tints, and tones that further direct pollinators towards the floral rewards of nectar or pollen, much like the nighttime runway lights in an airport. Ultraviolet invitations are also helpful to bees in directing them to their pollen and nectar resources. These are terms that you may see, especially in nurseries that sell plants, and other information as you're looking at considerations for your pollinator garden. Natives occur in a region without human intervention and generally defined as plants growing prior to European colonization. Insects and other animals have co-evolved with native plants. Native plants are the preferred host plants for native insects. The nutritional value of the foliage is known. They are adapted to the local soil and climate, and they support the local ecosystem. What I am showing is a poster from the Texas State Highways Department, and it divides the state of Texas into growing regions. And what's important about this is you see a plant that's identified as a Texas native. It may very well be a plant that grows in the Big Bend area. So when you're looking at natives, there's consideration native to what area? Is it native to Texas? Is it native to Galveston County? Is it native to Harris County? And when we propagate plants at our Clear Lake chapter for our plant sales, we, for the most part, really try to rely on plants that are native to our immediate ecoregion. So just to know, if you're looking at resources online and it's listed that a California poppy is native to Texas, do a little more research to make sure what part of Texas that California poppy is native to, because it's much more well suited to a more desert area. Cultivars are selectively bred for certain traits, like color, shape, and size. They may or may not produce nectar or seed, and they may or may not support butterflies, birds, and other wildlife. Nativars are popular names for cultivars of native plants. They also have been selected for specific plant traits. Some have no nectar or pollen and sterile seed. Why are native plants important? They tend to be drought tolerant. They provide habitat and resources for butterflies, bees, and other local wildlife. They generally don't need special pampering. They're native to the ecosystem, and they help maintain biological diversity. Doug Tallamy is an entomologist and has written extensively about native resources. And I think Bev is going to mention some of his work around trees and how those trees are very important to ecosystems and especially pollinators. He is proposing a concept called homegrown national parks, which is a call to action to restore habitat where we live and work, and to some extent where we farm and graze, extending national parks to our communities. He says if every home gardener nationwide created an environment to attract pollinators, we would add tens of thousands of acres for them to call home. He says our national parks, no matter how grand in scale, are too small and separated from one another to preserve species to the levels that are needed. Remember, you need to have food for the babies as well as food for the adults in your garden. Select some plants for pollen and nectar, other plants for leaves that feed caterpillars. Seeds are more economical. Generally in our area, you would plant those in the fall or late winter. Plants give a quick return and attract pollinators sooner. Some plants are prolific self-seeders, so you might want to consider a combination of seeds and plants, annuals and perennials. Once again, if you're considering seeds, research the specifics of your plant choices. Some seeds grow very easily by simply patting them into more soil, while others need specific treatment to attain a good germination rate. This is the case for a number of our native milkweed. Cold moist stratification greatly improves the germination rate for some of these seeds, like some of our native milkweeds. Native Plant Society chapter provides workshops on the various methods of growing plants from seeds. You can also check your online resources. One of your requirements for the grant application will be to identify the plants that you would like to use in your garden. As you create your plant list, it's important to consider the availability. There may be some plants that are listed as great pollinator resources for this area, and yet when you go to try to find those to purchase, you may not be able to get them. So that's one consideration. Are these actually available through seeds or through local plant sales? One of my best sources to create a plant list for my pollinator gardens has been this. And you can see that this is well worn and it's got a lot of marks on it. This is my original copy from 2017 when I attended my first Native Landscape Certification Program, Level 1. These are workshops provided by the Native Plant Society. They have a number of different levels. They also have one specific to plants that are favorites for birds. And so I would encourage you also to consider attendance at one of those. They're generally held in the spring and in the fall. And I think our chapter has one that we'll be providing in conjunction with the Houston Native Plant Society. Nancy and Bev are both presenters for that. You'll need to consider mature size and growth habit of your plants. The passion vine at the top right of your screen is a wonderful addition to a pollinator garden. But if you plant it next to your rock rose that's in the lower left, the passion vine will completely overtake the rock rose. So give the passion vine a trellis and the space it needs to ramble, and you'll both be a lot happier. Since many of your plants will be small when they're planted, you might consider, like I've already mentioned, using filler plants the first year to provide more plant coverage, but without impacting the long-term growth of your perennials. Another topic that you need to be familiar with are invasive plants. These are plants that you will want to avoid and remove if they invite themselves to your garden. In this area, Chinese tallow is a non-native invasive tree that has caused massive disruption to the native ecosystem. But there are a number of other invasives that are also likely to appear in your garden. There are quite a few resources to help identify what the likely invasives are in this area, including the Native Landscape Certification Program plant list, like I just showed you. So every level of that program has a specific list also of invasives to be aware of. There is a handout on the table here that also shows you and lists names of some local invasives. There are lots of other online resources that can help you identify that. One application that I use very frequently is iNaturalist to help me identify plants as well as pollinators when I'm unsure of the ID. So if you see something popping up in your garden, you're not sure if it's good or bad, you post it to the iNaturalist app, it will help identify what that is, and you can determine if it's something you want to keep or not. Preparing the site. Healthy soil is the key to healthy plants. Historically, our soils had about a mix of air and water and minerals that was ideal for growing the native plants. Construction-induced erosion, compaction, overgrazing, pollution, and other impacts have greatly reduced the organic content, which in turn reduces the oxygen content. Adding organic matter, such as compost, improves the water retention qualities of the soil, as well as providing nutrients for the plants and space for root development. If you're working with an existing bed or going to add to it or transition it to a native plant, a pollinator community, you need to decide which plants you want to keep, remove any invasives, and also are there nearby plants that might require some changes. If you're considering a new bed, you'll need to remove the grass and other non-desired plants, especially invasive, and also decide whether to till. Some people really think tilling is the best way to start a new bed, but you do have to be considerate of tree roots, utility lines, and other hazards that might be under the soil. You could also consider a raised bed where you simply surround the area with a border, cover the ground with cardboard or newspaper, and you add soil and compost on top of the area. Pre-planting. As your planting site is being prepared, then consider use of newspaper or cardboard to prevent new weed growth. Ultimately, you'll probably want to consider some type of mulch, but in the process, newspapers and cardboard are very easy to move around, and they also really reduce the growth of unwanted plants in there. When you plant, make sure you're considering the height and spread at maturity for your plants. Probably most all of us that have done much planting have experienced putting a plant in that really got a lot bigger than we expected it to. So almost all the plants have some information about how big they get. Now, if you have a basket flower, and I looked up the information about basket flowers this morning, it says they can get from 2 to 6 feet. 2 to 6 feet is a huge range when you're trying to plan your garden. So do keep that in mind. Some plants, if they're really, really happy with the place you have them, they will get that maximum height. Others may just stay at a much lower height. You'll need to water your plants before you put them in and then thoroughly after that. Some advice for planting also says the planting hole you dig, you should fill with water and let it drain, and then put your watered plant in there, and then put the soil in, and then water it again. If you're planting anything right now in your garden, probably every bit of that advice is what you should follow because it's so hot and so dry. But these are just basic recommendations for planting anytime. Certainly now you have to be much more aware of how quickly things are drying out. Possible additions to the planting site, the planting hole, would be microlite. It's an organic biological fertilizer. And you may have some other things or find other suggestions online for biological or organic amendments. You will probably want to mulch between plants to keep the soil moist and to help prevent weeds. You need to be careful when you're applying mulch not to mount it right up to the plant stalk itself. Mulch can heat up, especially with the temperatures we're having right now. And if you put it right up to the base of the plant, that heat can kill the plant. And I have done that. I'm guilty of doing that. So if you do put mulch out, make sure you keep it a little bit further from the actual base of the plant.
I have a quick question. So if I have like old mulch in my bed, should that be removed before?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
What I would do, if you have mulch, I would probably just move it out of the space. Okay. Just move it away from the hole that you were digging. Or if you're doing a lot of small holes, just move it to the side.
Okay.
As long as it's, a good type of mulch that will eventually just break down, then I don't think it's necessary to remove it out. Maintenance. The graphic for maintenance is circular because maintenance doesn't end. Maintenance requires more of your time in the beginning, but ultimately it will never completely end. And so on your grant application, you will need to specify how you're going to provide maintenance for your garden. And hopefully you have a team to help you. In the beginning, you will need to have frequent watering, and the maintenance schedule really needs to be a more intensive maintenance schedule needs to be considered for the first 2 years. You'll need to do some type of mulching. Mulching can either be a commercially purchased mulch, or if you have access to leaves, local leaves are a great type of mulch to use in your bed. But at least in the beginning, you'll probably need to use some type of mulch to prevent unwanted plant growth and weeds from taking over your newly established bed. You'll need to continue to control invasives, and you'll need to be careful to provide and protect bee nest site and caterpillar host plants. You'll need to leave some patches of bare earth for ground nesting bees and also for butterflies. And you'll need to have signage to help identify the area. It's recommended that you be lazy about fall and winter. If at the end of the summer or the end of the fall, you go out and you rake up everything so it looks very tidy, you cut down all of your plant stalks, you will probably taking away a lot of the places where your pollinators would be overwintering. So it's recommended that you leave things where they are at least through the winter and through late winter before you go out there and you cut down all of the plant stalks. And I really try to leave all of my leaves. I put them in beds and they just decompose over time on their own. It's okay to leave the seed heads. And the picture in the middle is actually a woody plant stalk that a carpenter bee has dug into. And I have an example of that here, where a carpenter bee has actually dug into that plant stalk. So when my husband went out and started cutting down all these plant stalks where I'd seen the carpenter bees, I had to run out and tell him, these are not just dead plant stalks that need to be disposed of. And so that's the kind of thing you'll need to be careful about, making sure anyone who is working in your garden area realizes that even if it looks a little messy, even if it looks dead, it is providing habitat for your pollinators. These are pollinators that I took pictures of at the end of September last year. Don't forget about the fall pollinator needs. Fall bloomers like seaside goldenrod, blue mist, ironweed, and bidens are easy to overlook with so many alluring options for spring and summer. In fact, some people intentionally exclude these particular plants because they can be enthusiastic spreaders. and they tend to look very unimpressive during most of the year. However, these are your friends that will burst into bloom when so many others are completely exhausted from the long, oppressive summer. This is especially apparent right now, given our current drought and record-breaking heat. These fall blooming plants provide the critically needed resources of nectar and pollen for migrating populations, as well as provisions for overwintering pollinators. Define their space in your garden, pick out the unwanted volunteers if they spread, and enjoy their vibrant display and the winged visitors they attract in the fall. Once again, from the Xerces Society, nesting and overwintering habitat for pollinators and other beneficial insects. So we talked a little bit about leaving the leaves. A lot of pollinators and native bees use that for habitat. It's important, if you have the ability to obtain them, to leave some cut pieces of logs. If a branch falls out of a tree or there's some kind of maintenance that needs to be done to take down a tree or do substantial trimming, you can place chunks of that wood, those small logs, either use them as a border area, or you can just set them in places throughout the garden. And they will be used by all sorts of insects, including your pollinators. Rethink how you use mulch. There's a tendency, especially if you drive through neighborhoods, to see properly maintained garden beds to be completely mulched with a commercial mulch. That's not the habitat that is most beneficial to pollinators. So I use a combination, especially if I'm doing a new bed and I don't have enough leaves. I will purchase mulch, native mulch. But as much as possible, I do, and as plants mature, I don't need to use that as often. I can use leaves more often. That's one thing we need to get away from, covering all the surfaces either with St. Augustine, lawn, or mulch. You also need to provide a safe water source. And in the grant application, you will be asked to specify what your water source is. Water source for pollinator gardens really means two things. One is you need a water source to be able to water your plants as you are getting them established, as you are maintaining them. So on the grant, you will need to say, what is your water source for getting water to your garden? The other thing is that your pollinators need a water source. And so one of the very easiest suggestions for that is to just have a shallow saucer. You can use the large clay saucers that are plant saucers and just put some pebbles in those and add water to them. That's appropriate for pollinators to be able to use for their water source. So the presentation so far has really focused on elements that anyone would need to consider for a pollinator garden. Specifically now, if you are looking to make a grant application to use in a public space, these are some suggestions that you would need to consider. The first thing you'll need to do is to form a team. If you're working in a public space, hopefully you've got some other people. If you're in a school, you're in a city organization looking at a park, you can get some team members to help you. You'll also need to get approval, depending on where your garden is, who you're affiliated with. You might need to go to a principal, you might need to go to a city management department. You'll need to develop a budget, and you'll need to choose a specific site. As you design your garden, you can also include a lot of the concepts that we've gone through here. You and your team will need to create a work plan for site prep, a work plan for installation, and you'll also need to include a maintenance schedule. Especially important if you're working with the school district, is you identify who is going to be available through those summer months. And it's going to be very interesting to see for the application, the grant applications we awarded this past year, as we asked for what those sites are now looking like, how people were able to manage their gardens through the summer, especially for new plantings put in this spring. It has been a grueling summer to try to keep anything alive. And so just know that if you are setting up a garden that's not yours in your own home, it's at a public place that you'll need to drive to. You have to have a team set up to provide that maintenance, especially in the summer, regardless of where the garden is. We talked about some of the site preparation. So you need to make sure whoever your entity is, the organization you're working with, understands all of these elements and understand the phases that your garden will be going through. Because in the beginning, it's not going to look pretty. And it may not look really pretty for a while, but let the entity you're working with understand the phases that are involved. Plant the garden. And so this sounds like one day you go out and you put all your plants in the garden and that's it. And that's probably not how it's going to work. You may have a list of plants that you would like. And then your next step is to try to figure out where are you going to get those plants? Can you actually get them at local native plant sales? There's a number of coming up this fall. In the spring, there are a number of those offered as well. Are you going to try to get seeds and start some of your plants from seeds? It will probably be a process of planting. A process of planting may be even over a number of months. You might put some things in the fall. You might put more things in early spring. You might plant some seeds in the late winter and make sure you can keep those moist. So planting, it very likely is not a one-day event. And planting is also probably something to consider back in that maintenance circle, because you may have an idea of what you want your garden to be now. And then a year from now, you've seen some things grow and you decide you want to make some changes. So planting may be something you continue to do as you watch how your garden develops. And very importantly, you need to share your story about what you're doing. And what is really neat is from the very beginning, you can have a photo history of what's going on. Your site before you've done anything to it. And then every time as you do one more change to it, you put a border in, you have a work crew, you have students, whoever is out there helping you. You do a photo history because you'll get to the end and you'll think, oh my gosh, I should have recorded it. So think about that from the beginning. You'll really appreciate having it. Let the media know, whoever the media know. Do you have a local newspaper? Do you have electronic media sources that you can post this on? Spread the word about your achievement. And also put your sign up so that anyone coming to your area will be aware of the importance and specifically what this area is. It's not just something that looks like an unmaintained garden. And I say that because at the end of the summer, a lot of the pollinator habitats may look a little dated because you've left your dead plant stalks, you've left your seed heads on, and it's not maintained in a pristine way because that's not what the pollinators need. So make sure you have your signage up there to alert everyone about what's going on. This comes back to that Pollinator Habitat Grant. We've talked about the elements that are necessary for creating a pollinator habitat. You'll need food for the babies, like larval host plants. You'll need food for the adults, nectar-producing plants for the entire growing season, early spring, and spring actually starts in February. The first blooming plant, a lot of those are our local small native trees that have flowers even at the end of February. So really February through November, you can have blooms if you select your plants carefully. Your pollinators need water to drink and they need places to live. They don't spend 24 hours collecting pollen and nectar, drinking nectar. They need other places to rest. So make sure they have resources for that. To maintain your pollinator garden, you have to have access to water for your plants. And it's part of the grant application to have signage to designate it as a special area, and also to educate visitors like maintenance crews that this is a special area not to be mowed. Some people may even need to put, depending on what kind of crews are working in your area, you may even need to put signage up that, it's a do not mow area. Because it has certainly happened more than once. A sign has been put in a pollinator garden, and then in some manner, the sign is no longer there. And so signs, for whatever reason, disappear. And especially if we're talking about public spaces, there are a lot of people that may have access to this area. So don't be shocked at some point if you go out and your sign's not there. It could be just routine cleanup. Someone didn't really understand why the sign was there. But please try to keep a sign up at all times. And our chapter has, I think we have a couple of versions, native plant garden signs that are available for a pretty nominal cost. And we'll have those available for purchase at our plant sale in the fall. Sources of seeds and plants. I tried to list some sources here just to be helpful. I am not giving you a guarantee of any of these sources, but they're there for you to use or consider. The one that I will say we tend to have certainly more control over is the first one for the fall and spring plant sales that our local Native Plant Society chapter does. A lot of the plants that we sell are plants that we have propagated from seed ourselves. A lot of times locally sourced seed, or if we purchase seeds, we do it from a supplier that we have faith in is really providing us the native seeds we expect to get and ones that have not been chemically treated. The Houston chapter of the Native Plant Society also provides a workshop every September called Wildscapes. And it's a very informational workshop. And they also have a native plant sale in conjunction with that. That's held up in Houston. The Houston Audubon Society also has what they call a natives nursery. They provide online sales, and also in the spring and fall, they have an on-site sale where you can go purchase your plants. I think it takes about an hour to get there from this area, so it's a little bit of a drive, but they have excellent plants as well. Native American Seed Company has a lot of resources for plants, as well as an excellent interactive website that you can use to help define your selection based on exactly where you live in Texas and the type of plant you want, even the color you want. And so you can put this information into their website and it will help you define their selections. I also have some catalogs from them. And what I like about their catalogs is they have absolutely beautiful pictures of pollinators and plants. So if you're wanting to get just a visual of what a particular plant may look like, you could even use their catalog as a quick source for that. There are two local retail plant stores on here. And I say local, well, I'm talking Houston metro area. One is Friendswood Hardware and one is Buchanan's Native Plants, and that's up in Houston in the Heights. The reason I've listed them here is that they have now said that they want to partner with our Native Plant Society organization. And it's under the auspices of what our state Native Plant Society has developed as Natives Improve and Conserve Environments, with the acronym being NICE. And so these two commercial plant stores, and they sell other things than plants, are trying to work with us to help identify truly what are natives. And even these stores sell things other than just true natives. They also sell cultivars and nativars, but they are trying to work with us to really make sure the people coming to them to buy understand what they are buying. I've certainly bought plants marked as native in past years, get them home, and eventually realize this really isn't a native plant. And so these two nurseries are really trying to work with us to be more precise about using the term native. And we are actually having members of our chapter during a couple of different weekends in September be at both of these nurseries just to talk with the public as they're coming through and answer questions about the use of native plants and what are native plants. Let's see, I've got the dates even down here. Friendswood Emporium will have representatives on September 16th, and then Buchanan's will have representatives on September 30th. Resources. So I have to tell you that the Native Plant Society of Texas Clear Lake chapter has an immense amount of resources already available to you. We have monthly chapter meetings that are available to anyone who wants to attend. These right now are virtual meetings. They've been virtual meetings since the beginning of COVID. We keep talking about going back to at least doing hybrid meetings, but for now, they're virtual meetings. So the second Monday of every month, you can just sit in your home and log on to our chapter meeting. You do need to register prior to the meeting to get a link to it. And you can do that either directly from our website or you can sign up for our newsletter. And that will also have a link for you to get your invite. You can find out about field trips and workshops through our newsletter and our website. Our plant sale that will be held here at University of Houston Clear Lake at this location, EIH, will be October 20th and October 21st. The fall plant sale does have more of an opportunity to purchase trees and shrubs, which tend to do well when planted in the fall, so the roots have time to get established before the heat of the summer sets in. Another great resource is the electronic catalog online that can be found associated with the plant sales. It will give you a wealth of information about not only what plants are being sowed, but what conditions the plants need, and the size of those plants. So it's a wonderful catalog. Online resources. If you've done internet searches, you can probably come up with more resources than you can even attempt to wade through. But these are some of the ones that are considered very appropriate to doing local pollinator gardens. The Houston chapter, Native Plant Society, has a lot of information, pages and pages of information about which plants are most appropriate for this region, and special areas like plants that grow in the shade, plants that grow in full sun, plants that birds prefer, plants that pollinators prefer. So their website also has a wealth of information. Pollinator Partnership is also an excellent resource. For anyone who needs a very basic list of plants to start a pollinator habitat in this area, I would recommend the 9 Natives list by Coastal Prairie Conservancy. There is also some excellent information about pollinators from the National Butterfly Center. The National Butterfly Center is down in South Texas, but they have a very, very helpful website that talks about a lot of information regarding specific pollinators. I have a book here from the Xerces Society, and they also have a lot of good information. Lady Bird Johnson is also, once again, a thorough website to help you get information about plants. These are a few books specific to helping make selections about pollinator gardens. We are fortunate enough to live in a region where we can still support at-risk species like the American bumblebee and the monarch butterfly. And hopefully we can work collectively to expand the habitat needed by these fascinating and essential pollinators.
I have a lot less to say than Cheryl does, so don't worry, we're not doing another full hour here or anything of the sort. Cheryl sort of conceived of this idea. She's on the education committee, and we just wanted to make sure that people truly understood what they were asking for and how to go about it. And I think that was an excellent idea. And she was the author of this day, and she did an absolutely comprehensive job. In fact, as I was listening to her, a lot of what I say, she's already said. So this is going to be a bit of a rerun. I asked to be added because I think oftentimes people neglect the idea of the role that trees have in pollinating. And in some ways, trees are in places that a formal garden don't exist. So we have to be grateful for them in that respect too. Every single thing that Cheryl said, I concur. And bringing in trees specifically is just part of a balanced, coordinated process as far as I'm concerned. And there really isn't much need to even define the difference between plants and trees, because trees are plants. They're in the same, when you go way back to animal kingdom, plant kingdom, all trees are plants, but not all plants are trees. And this is kind of obvious, but I thought I'd mention it anyway, that one of the reasons that trees are separate from what we're conditioned to think of as plants is, number one, they stick around a lot longer than plants. Some plants, an average life for a plant, the tree is about 80 years, but there are some that are 6,000 years old. And anything in between. Some only are good for 30 or 40 years, but that's still a lot longer longevity than most plants. Also, instead of a stem, they have a woody bark. That is a oftentimes used definition of a tree, and they're certainly bigger than most plants. So in the fine details, there's quite a bit of information, but basically there's roots, and the root system is completely important to plants and trees. And then from there, once they break ground, that's when the differences occur. They all photosynthesize from their leaves or their needles. So in many, many ways, those are all similar processes. These are just two examples of what I consider to be very, very attractive trees for a garden area, which is kind of what we're aiming at here. We're certainly not doing industrial planting or anything. This is the eastern redbud. That's a fringe tree. We'll talk about that later, but this is one of the very first nectar sources in the spring. So it's an absolutely eye-catching, beautiful plant, but it's also a native and fits in well here. The relationship to pollinator gardens, about 60% of active pollinators have some relationship with a tree. That's a big number. They might use it for habitat. They might use it for protection from storms and wind and cold weather. They might lay their eggs there. A lot of eggs, when they blossom out, they'll eat on the tree first before they're capable of going around and pollinating plants in other areas. So that's kind of their nursery. They have a lot of protection from predators. A lot of the insects and the butterflies and things that you were aware of, if they feel like they're in a predated situation, they will go hide in a tree. It's much easier to hide in a tree than it is in the small bush or the small plant. And so it's kind of important that there are trees around, because it's also another source to extend their lives as well. Some predators go and rest at night. Cheryl mentioned that they're not buzzing around getting nectar and pollen all 24 hours a day. A lot of them are resting up there in the trees and the branches and the leaves. And trees are also often one of the first nectar sources. I know that Drummond red maples are blooming in February. These usually aren't exactly February, but certainly close thereafter. So they are one of the very first nectar sources to give them the sugar that they need and the energy that they need to begin their process of pollinating things so that we can have the enjoyment of those. And also trees can be the host plant, the actual host plant for quite a few different varieties. Here I had selected to just show you butterflies. That doesn't mean that they aren't hosting other places as well, but like the question mark uses all the elms. You'll frequently see them around. I have a tree stand that I'm related to, and there aren't very many butterflies out there, but where I see butterflies on the elms. So they're a good choice. And there are some small elms, morning cloaks like the willows, swallowtails like the ashes, and the tulip trees and the birch trees. So, and this is just a small example, but as it says, trees can be a host for eggs, the larva, the habitat, predator protection, weather protection, and more. Okay, and here's some caterpillars at work. One thing that I thought was interesting when I was reading one of Doug Tallamy's books, he wrote a book specifically about oaks, and he took every month of the year and described what the oak tree was doing at that point. He lives in Pennsylvania, and he kept noticing that these blue jays were going in and out of his oak trees. He's an entomologist, and at this point is already well studied. And he went out there, and much to his surprise, he was watching live caterpillars going out and crawling on the branches at that time of year. And so caterpillars are extremely important for birds to feed their babies. Even though they may be seed eaters themselves, they have to have these insects. And oak trees are a phenomenal source for that. Another thing that I'll say about caterpillars, when they do eat a lot of leaves, I like to think of a beautiful, well-tended pollinator garden as having leaves that have bites all over it, or some leaves are completely gone. And we have to change our idea of what we think is a beautiful floral situation. I know a lot of people can think of the tea rose, beautiful, perfect leaves. You have to learn, if you're going to get into this and really try to share it with others, we are going to have to change our settings so that we appreciate when we see that there's caterpillars that have chewed on these things. And that when you see leaves that are really chewed, I mean, if you've got leaf cutters around, if you've ever seen a redwood bud with caterpillars, I mean, there's bites all over the place. They look like puzzle pieces. Mm-hmm. And you should rejoice. This means you've succeeded. It's a wonderful thing. Okay, and as she said, and I was thrilled she said it because most people don't ever get around to talking about this aspect. Trees don't have to even be alive to be completely important to the pollinator process. They're important when they're snags. And if you have acreage where you have trees that have died that aren't going to be imperiling anybody, it's becoming very recommended that you let your snags stay. There's probably 1,000 different critters on that right there. Now, not all those critters are pollinators because they're too small. Some of them are just providing the decomposition process. However, the decomposition process is important for pollinators as well, because we have to, these trees don't go to H-E-B for their food. They get it from the soil. They're pulling it up from the soil for their body products. And when you think about all the things that is necessary to grow a tree, that's pretty darn impressive. So we cut them down and throw them away. Well, that grocery store of nutrients just went out the door. So if you can do down dead, now this is more of a park situation, but sometimes, I think if you've got a yard, there should be somewhere that you have a stick pile. There should be somewhere that maybe you would use a log for an accent piece in a garden. Those things are full of nutrients that can and should be reused. And also, it decomposes it in different states. So at different times, there'll be different plants on there. I just had an example of wintering trees, partly because these pictures are so beautiful and you guys are not used to seeing trees. I'm telling you, I grew up in Michigan, and there were days you just had to go outside and walk, even though it was 5 below, because it was just so darn beautiful. And so are ice storms. But I know they cause a lot of damage. And then there are certain plants that are still available for birds at that time of year. They persist in the winter. There's all kinds of organisms sitting there on those trees. Going back to what Doug Tallamy says, and they were serious. They took nets, and they took interns and nets, and they put nets completely enclosing these different kinds of trees, not all oaks, other kinds as well. Then for that use only, they used pesticide and killed whatever was living on those trees, carefully brought those nets down, and people came in from all sides to completely document what was on the ground in that net that had been on that tree, so that they knew who was there and how many. And he said that oaks can have up to 468 insects on them, which is the best. Mexican plums come in at $270, and they are a beautiful understory plant. Willows, $229. Crepe myrtles, $4. This is just an example of how some bugs just find their way and intrude themselves. And you might say, well, those aren't really pollinators, but it might feed pollinators. It might be the energy protein for some of those other things. But when you, like Doug says, 468 insects in a tree, you lean right against them and don't even realize that they're there. I mean, sometimes there'll be those army ants explosions where they're literally falling down on you, but that's not very typical, you know. And I know you've seen cicadas and all that kind of stuff, but these trees are teeming with these bugs. And leaf litter. Cheryl did a good job talking about leaf litter too, which is also underappreciated. What you are looking at here is gold. Okay, all those nutrients that I was talking about that came in through the roots are now coming out in leaf litter. And that's another diadem change we have to have. If you're raking up all your leaves and all of your particulate from trees, bagging them up, throwing them to the curb, to the trash man, you are throwing away money, you are throwing away energy, you are throwing away nutrients. We have to learn to think that this is beautiful to look at. And if this is beautiful to look at, we have to learn that returning that stuff around the base of the tree and filling it in your actual garden is well worth your time. And if it's not as beautiful and pristine as your neighbors, well, it's time for them to start to learn what kind of processes we're going for. We have to learn to appreciate these. I know people, after their neighbors spend the weekend bagging everything up, they go and take bags and bring them home and use them, as well we should. I do some bagging up because I take them to the tree stand that I work with in Bakeland, but I think there just isn't enough to say about leaf litter. And the one little sentence that I read, not from Doug, but from somewhere else, dead wood and leaf litter is indispensable for nutrients, residence, and breeding for 10% of all land species. The other aspect of leaf litter, it's just teeming with life. It's teeming with life the whole time. And there are centipedes, millipedes, bees. There are all kinds of things in there that are helping to decay it, decompose it, as well as enriching your soil. There's no downside here. If you're doing gardening, you need to have a stick pile behind your garage with a log here and there, elsewhere, and leave this. You want to rake it up in March. Okay. One thing that I wanted to mention is the grant program will include trees, understory trees, canopy trees, shrubs in your, if you have a place that is, you think going to have the longevity to support growing a long-term plant. This is just a minor example, but these are some of the more beautiful ones. I also have a list that you can take a picture of, but this actually comes off the DIPSOT website. There is so much information out there. It's not hard to come up with any of that anymore. Also, we have a catalog online that is currently until September 5th for ordering trees, because trees are a big maintenance item. So we are doing trees and shrubs by order. So if you go online now, and I'll tell you, when you go to like the box stores or even some of the nurseries, there's a lot of trees you can't find. When you see our list, there's a lot of trees that are difficult to come by that you might really enjoy in your yard. September 5th is the last day. We might have an assortment of trees that are available ad hoc. We're not 100% sure about that now, but when you come to the plant sale, you might want to look at those too if you decided you've got room for a tree. And one of my last comments that I wanted to make is, I know that you've all heard that there are places that are like food deserts. There are people that are living in neighborhoods that are 5, 8, 12 miles away from any place to buy groceries. If you don't have a tree in your yard, you have created a food desert for the very pollinators that you're trying to encourage. Okay.
Can you share with us any trees where their leaf litter would not be beneficial? Where the leaves may be toxic or
Not natives.
okay. How
Yeah,
about
they've
not
all-
native trees?
There are some non-native trees. There are some conifers that can have there's acidity and
Right, yeah.
alkaline, and depending on where you live. But if you're planting a native tree, which would be the optimum, it's okay. They pretty much, now I'm not saying I'm 100% sure because I haven't researched that so much, but the whole idea of the native ecology is that most things have grown up, especially the native trees.
So oak leaves that are abundant, you don't have to take them away from some of your other native plants. But
If I could
Yeah,
add one
please
thing,
do.
certainly support everything you say. There are some trees, their leaves have some chemicals in them that discourage other things from growing underneath them, like tallows. Well, like even a magnolia tree, their leaves, of course, they're very thick and large, but there are chemicals in their leaves that discourage other things from growing. In my yard, I do tend to dispose of the magnolia leaves. Those are probably the one thing, just because they take so long. Not all of them. Some of them I do put in the very back where I have stuff that's going to take a year or more to break down. But I don't leave those magnolia leaves where I want something else to grow. Like I have a magnolia tree with a big bed under it, which is very hard to get something to grow. And so I take the leaves out of that bed. But my oak leaves, I tend to put in my other beds, and I really don't have problems with them inhibiting other things to grow. They break down. So I think, probably what you're referring to or what you can find information on, that they have chemicals in. And I think con trees are said to be the same way.
Do you have a southern magnolia? I know there's a lot of magnolias
It's a
here.
big one, so it's one of the big ones. So it probably isn't a southern magnolia. I know they have smaller varieties, but mine is.
And oak leaves, they break down slow. Yeah.
If my space doesn't get a lot of like tree litter, would it be beneficial to like? So I have a lot of students and families, and they all want to help, and I know they could collect tree litter. If I knew what kind of tree it came from, would it be okay to like transplant it to our school? Okay.
Yeah,
It doesn't necessarily have to be
the trees that are like,
right. Okay.
no. I mean, I'm just telling you, there's a lot of cedars out here in front. I go rake up off the street
Mhm.
and take those elsewhere, et cetera, et cetera.
What about pine needles?
Pine needles are good.
Oh, yeah, pine needles.
good?
are
Yeah.
good. That's what I thought.
And they break down slowly too. One good thing about pine needles, you know how you're not supposed to put anything close to a stem or a trunk? Pine needles are, by their design, a lot of air. So, you can
okay.
kind of put them the closest and then build around it with other stuff.
Gotcha.
Okay. Because they're very, very.
The Dickinson Library now has a place where you can go pick up and deposit seeds. So you can go to the Dickinson Library and maybe get some of these native seeds so that you don't have to buy them. And my second thing is there's the Galveston County Plant Swap. If you're looking for some free plants for your school, they have places called orphan plants of people who the plants didn't go for a swap. They put them there and you can take them.
It's October 14th, 8 to 12. And it's blooming on the bayou.
Helen Hall Library also just started a seed repository, whatever it's called. Yeah. And they're just getting off the ground.
All right, well, let's go on to the nitty gritty here. Such great information we've been getting. That this will be about the grant application itself. Now, to find the grant application, I hope many of you have gotten there. We have a new chapter website, so be sure you know this link to get there. Then, if you come to it and you see our famous spider lilies, on the back of our shirts and everything else, then you're at the right place. The 3 lines up at the top right-hand corner. I don't know, is there a name for that?
The menu?
Yeah. You click on that and you want to select programs and then select the Native Pollinator Habitat Grant Program. All right, this important areas to consider Okay, here's our bumblebees in my yard on the partridge pea. The deadline for applying, finishing your application September 15th, fill in all the boxes. And as Cheryl did a great job on the maintenance, I loved her circle of jobs or whatever we would call it. That is critical. You know, we think if even this year, if you were managing a pollinator garden, would it be surviving? You know, can you get water to it? I have put in a small pollinator garden. My watering system is 4-gallon jugs of water. And so every morning when I drive past there, not every morning, but a lot of mornings I'll stop and, you know, water them all with these gallon jugs of water, which they are surviving, but just barely, I think. Funds available are up to $500. Said be realistic about what your needs are. We had a little Girl Scout troop that applied one year, and their garden was maybe if we put 2 tables together, that was the size of their garden. So they knew they didn't need $500 because the only things you can spend it on, native plants, native trees, native shrubs, native forbs, native grasses, native vines. But they can be purchased anywhere. But when you are shopping for a plant, be sure you have the binomial name, the scientific name, because some nurseries will inadvertently maybe call things native, which aren't necessarily native. So you want to check by that name the plant that you are looking for. So that can be kind of a search and find sort of thing. And just be aware that the plants that grown outside of our ecoregion may struggle to survive here. I mean, just because of, as Cheryl said, a Texas native doesn't mean that it can handle our, you know, what are we, 50 inches of rain a year, and then the heat, you know, 100 degrees for a month or more. Will it ever end? I don't know. And when you send in your application, these are the things the committee will be looking at. How completely the application is filled out. And if we think it's feasible. Benefit to the community, these are public gardens on public spaces. And does it meet our chapter goals? So kind of keep those things in mind as you're completing the application. That was my garden, but in springtime, I think it was February or March, the lantana was just lush. I wanted to add too that we're all aware of, sometimes our HOAs can give us a hard time, perhaps. But there is a state law that plants that address the drought tolerance, that are drought tolerant, have to be permitted. So I claim my whole front yard is plants that, you know, can be drought tolerant. And I laughed at our, I was on the board for a while. Our HOA is small, 64 houses. So there's 5 on the board. And the one gentleman, the treasurer on the board, has linked on to the drought tolerant rule, you know, and someone will complain about that lady that has all those weeds in her front yard. And he said, that's, you know, native plants that are drought tolerant. So I appreciate him, but it's, again, like Cheryl said, you might have to kind of trim the outside of your gardens. I have, well, those partridge pea of course, are searching for sunshine, and so they're leaning way out over the sidewalk. Well, then we had to kind of bend them back into the garden itself because they didn't like that. They were touching people, you know. Well, and the bees were very prominent on there, so that does make a difference. This is a new sign that our chapter, one of our gals, Mary Horn, has designed, and this will be for sale at the plant sale, October 20th and 21st. And this is also available in Spanish. So if your community, and I was going to say, Cheryl, when you talk about putting signage, you know, don't mow, put that in Spanish too. So this is going to be available then. The plant sale, October 20th is Friday, 4 to 6. And then Saturday morning, 8 to 10. Then I was going to mention a couple of other things. The native landscape class is November 4th, and it will be giving an in-person option as well as a Zoom portion. And that NLCP has 4 levels of classes, and we are teaching level 1. Now, this is, again, a state program. Throughout the state, they will offer like level 2 and level 3 and level 4. You have to have level 1 before you can take the other levels, but you can take the other levels in any order that you want to. So it's important to get that level 1. And yeah, question?
Yeah, I was just wondering, when will they offer the level 4?
I'm still working on that. They do have a class for birds. When you join the Native Plant Society, if you're joining our chapter, you are joining the state organization. And so they're the big umbrella. And then on their application will say what chapter or chapters do you want to be a part of. You get 1 chapter free, which is, we would hope, be our chapter. And then it's like a $6 charge if you want to be in a different chapter. Also, you can be in 2, 3, 4, 5 chapters if you want. And many of us are in the Houston chapter, and so we get their information too, which is good. You can join at any time. Like if you join in August, then your year will be up the following August. It follows you individually, so the state handles that. Okay, any of you live in NASA Bay? They offer MicroLife, the bags, for $25, which is a good deal, I think. So keep that in mind too. Are there questions?
See, the grant can't cover the cost of the sign.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just plans.
Just plants is the only thing.
Interesting.
And we kind of battle back and forth, you know, should we cover other than plants? But we kind of feel if you're at a school, then possibly, you know, the PTA might buy your sign for you, or some other group at the school that might be, or just a parents organization. So we're sticking to the plants only. But look at that list of trees and shrubs that we had, because that may be a good thing, you know, to kind of anchor your garden, maybe 2 or 3.
How many awards do you make each year?
So far, we do 3 $500 grants. There will be a list of reports that we ask you to complete. Okay, these are the dates and status reports that you will be asked to submit. So you would know by October 1st if you have received a grant. So then September 15th, deadline there, October 1st. Then the status reports, December, March, April, we say funds are to be spent unless an extension is requested. Well, it turns out our spring plant sale will be April 5th and 6th. So we're gonna be lenient and let that report or that funds be spent at our plant sale if you have to. And then the final report, May 1st. So that kind of keeps you on track too. Like I say, the maintenance portion of it is critical because it's hard, you know. I don't know how many people you're going to get to help you. The tentative plans, it's different your own home, and you know what your resources are. Either you got a spouse that'll do it for you or you don't, and then you figure out how you do it yourself. Or you have our HOA does the yard for us. Well, to kind of control what they do and what they don't do is a little bit tricky. There we go. That's what it'll look like. Go to question 18. Create the actual schedule and maintenance program. How many volunteers? What types of tasks? So on. So, and like I say, be sure you enter every box. One year we had trouble sending out the check because the wrong answer was in that box. And so that's critical too.
I would like to just mention too, as Cheryl was talking about photo histories, you definitely want to be doing a photo history of this from the beginning and all the way through. Not every year, but some years we have asked grantees to do a portion of our chapter meeting just to show off what has happened and where you've been. But even for your own sake and for your reports to us, you want a photo history. So with that trowel, bring that camera.
Yeah, be aware of the history. I know the one who said there was a garden there 10 years ago and it really needs help, and kind of plug in that history part. So that's important. And, with your, don't we say the compass card, show us where north is, or show us is it in the sun, full sun, or is it and it's also critical on some of the gardens. Is it surrounded by school building? It's kind of an island in the middle.
Can you attach pictures to the application?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, so the application is available in two ways. We would prefer the online form, but you can download this just so that you can prepare it ahead of time.
But September 15th will be coming soon. Permissions, I've yellowed that, highlighted that. In your situation, what permissions are necessary? I mean, we can't just go digging up public property and putting in plants. The map of where our grants have been awarded in the past. From Galveston, yes, Galveston County,
All the way up to
Brazoria County, and Harris County. We prefer the southeast section of Harris County. We have had them way up the other side, and we can't go check on them. Sometimes we like to, take a little visit to these places. And yeah, there's our little list of resources there. All right. Well, I think that'll be the end then. I thank you all for
Thank you.